How effective are the Scrum events in a partial Scrum implementation? In all my years as a Scrum Master, I've got experience with teams struggling with this situation, so I'd like to share with you what I've tried, what's worked, what has not worked, and perhaps get some feedback from you so that we can help each other help our teams. The way I've decided to approach this is to walk through the different Scrum events, which I've jotted down here for reference. We've got the daily Scrum, the sprint review, sprint planning, and the sprint retrospective, as well as the sprint itself, which is a container for all of the other events. So let's get started with the daily Scrum. So the first anti-pattern that I want to talk about around the daily Scrum actually involves two behaviors. The first behavior that I want to talk about is people just give a status update, right? They're not talking about how they're going to get stories into the finish column. They're talking about their status individually. And the other anti-pattern is people just kind of ramble on and on about lots of technical detail. They talk about things that are not on the board, and they may even talk about things that the team is not even involved in, that they're involved in personally. So what you do to resolve that issue is simple. You talk about the stories instead of going person to person. So if you have a lot of things on your board, you can start from right to left. Let's say you have a column for QA testing. You go through the items in the QA testing column first. You talk about how you're going to get that story into the done column, what needs to be done in order for that to happen. Then you move over and you say you've got a column for code review. So what needs to be done to get these code reviews complete? And then you've got one for in development. So what's going on with this story? How can we get that story into code review so that it can get closer to moving into testing, and so on. So that's a great way to get the whole team rallied around the conversation, because what happens is if you're talking about a story, then everyone gets involved and everyone talks about their role in that story instead of talking about what they're doing individually. Okay, the next topic for the daily Scrum is that you've got way too many items in progress and people do not understand their priorities. One way to solve that is to implement two Kanban metrics. One is called work in progress, and the other one is called work item age. Work in progress means that you limit the number of items that can be in progress at the same time within a particular state. So if you've got a work in progress limit on your QA testing column of 3, that means that if the developers finish a story and want to push it over into QA, they can't do it until one of those items gets complete, which forces the developers to help out the testers to get that done first. Then they can go back, move that development story over, and pick up another development story. The other metric that helps is work item age, because if you focus on the oldest item in the sprint, that means the item that's been in progress the longest, that gives the team priority. And the reason that it's helpful to use that metric is because older items, things that have been in progress for a long time, represent waste and the risk of not getting that done. So the time spent on that issue will be wasted if it's never completed. The next anti-pattern I'd like to talk about for Daily Scrum is ownership of the stories themselves and the team asking you to make updates to the stories instead of them doing it. While that seems kind of minor, actually I think it's a pretty big deal, because if the team's not making updates to the stories, they don't really see any value in using the stories. They're not utilizing them for communication. And in my opinion, the stories are really about communication. So if you're in Daily Scrum and the team asks you to move a story status from one place to another, you could probably do that. But if they are asking you to make updates into the contents or anything like that, or if they say, okay, so I need so-and-so to do this, what I would recommend is putting a note in the story and give an action to the person who made that statement to follow up on it and communicate within the story itself. If you can get the team to utilize the story itself for communication, that will start to bring focus on the story and bring value to using the story. Jira and other tools offer mechanisms where you can tag individuals when you make comments in the story, and the individuals will be notified, so the communication can definitely happen within the stories. So before we close on the topic of the Daily Scrum, I'd like to emphasize one very important point. The Daily Scrum is a planning meeting for the day. I like to emphasize that at the beginning of the Scrum meeting, And if they get off the rails during the meeting, I like to bring that back up and remind them of it. And even near the end of the meeting, remind them again and ask everyone if they understand how they fit in to the plan for the day. And oftentimes they will respond and say, I don't really know how I fit in. And should I be doing the things that I was planning to do, or should I be doing something else to help with that plan? So it can be a very powerful question. The next Scrum event we'll talk about is sprint review. One of the biggest issues I've observed with sprint review is you come into the sprint review and the previous sprint is still open. The stories are not up to date as far as status, and you have to go through the stories with the team just to determine what was done and what wasn't done, and then close the sprint out during the sprint review. That leaves very little time to address the true purpose of the sprint review, which is to talk with the customer about what was accomplished and provide material for the sprint planning session to help determine what should be done in the next sprint based on what was accomplished in the previous sprint. The way that I like to deal with that is I like to work with the team beforehand to make sure everything is accurate and up to date. Ideally, you want to actually close the sprint out before the sprint review starts. Next on the topic of the sprint review is involvement of the stakeholders. If there are no stakeholders at your sprint review, then how can it be a review of what was completed during the sprint? You need to have the stakeholders there so that they can provide feedback so that the team can plan the next sprint effectively to meet the needs of the stakeholder based on what was learned in the previous sprint. That includes a demo, so you need to really have a demo to show the stakeholders what was actually accomplished and give them a visual to provide that feedback. Sprint planning is the next meeting, and one obvious anti-pattern that I'd like to talk about is coming into the sprint planning meeting with carryover from the previous sprint, which you shouldn't have, and with really no clear understanding of the goals of that sprint. You can definitely mitigate that by working with the product owner and the tech leads beforehand to identify what you think the goals will be for that sprint based on what you understand about the current sprint. And you can usually have a very clear goal in mind. The other thing is using velocity from a story point and capacity perspective is useful, but if you've got a chaotic backlog, a lot of times you go into the sprint without the stories estimated. They're not really ready. And the team really struggles with commitment. So you end up with the team committing to many more stories than they can actually finish, or they commit to something that they're not even going to work on and they end up pulling other things in during the sprint. The way I'd recommend mitigating that is align things with the sprint goal and look at Kanban metrics like throughput, meaning the number of items that they've completed on average in a specific unit of time, that being a sprint, right? So you can look back at, X number of sprints and take the average number of items completed and simply load the sprint based on that with a certain number of stories rather than spending time getting sidetracked on capacity and story points, which aren't even accurate half the time if things weren't prepared in advance. Before we wrap up the discussion of sprint planning, I'd like to offer one thing that I do at every sprint planning session, and that is asking 3 questions. Is there anything here that does not need to be here? Is there anything missing? And is there anything here that can't be worked because of a blocker or readiness issues? All right, the next meeting to talk about is the retrospective, and you can really go deep with the retrospective. I've got a few videos on that. I will add cards in this video that you can click on and provide the links in the description so you can get more detail. But I'd like to talk about 3 anti-patterns. The first is that the meeting is basically a big complaint fest. It never really leads to any tangible results. But you can actually leverage that, and you can look at the meeting as kind of a counseling session for the team. And the outcome has to be that you provide something they can do in order to relieve the stress that they're feeling. If you don't come out with a solution, they're just going to carry that into the next sprint, and it's going to continue to erode the psychology of the team. So if you bring about a way that they can change the situation, they'll probably embrace it. They'll probably take the action and aggressively work it. The second thing is that the meeting is kind of an open discussion without a lot of structure. But you can definitely provide structure. There are many ways to do that. And one I like is setting the stage, gathering the data, generating insights, and deciding what to do. And I also have touched on that in another video, so you can take a look at that as well. And the last thing is that management is either at the meetings or observing the notes captured from the meetings. And that is very destructive because that creates it takes away actually psychological safety, where the team does not feel comfortable really talking about how they really feel because they may be penalized for it, right? And that just goes to a broader situation where you need to look at the organization, and there's probably a trust issue anyway in the organization. But the way you can address that immediately is you can ask management not to come to the retrospectives, and if there's anything that comes out of it that needs to go to management and the team agrees that it's okay to take it to management, then you can take it to management. And if you let them know that you're going to do that, they'll probably be more likely to accept your proposal.